There is a strange moment in human relationships when giving more begins to produce less. You reply faster, become more available, make more effort, and explain yourself more carefully, yet somehow the person you are trying hardest to keep becomes less interested in staying. That sounds irrational, but human behavior is often driven by something far less rational than gratitude, perceived value. The moment someone feels that your attention is guaranteed, they may stop wondering whether they can lose it. And when there is nothing left to lose, curiosity can disappear with it. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The solution isn't to become cold. It isn't to manipulate someone with delayed texts, fake indifference, or calculated silence. The deeper lesson is much harder. You have to become someone whose life does not collapse when another person walks away. Because Machiavelli understood something about power that applies far beyond politics. People do not respond only to what you give them. They respond to what your behavior tells them about your position. And sometimes, your greatest mistake isn't loving someone too much. It's abandoning yourself while doing it. Think about the last time you wanted someone's approval badly. Maybe you sent the second message because they didn't answer. Maybe you rearranged your entire schedule because they suddenly became available. Maybe they cancelled on you, and instead of deciding whether their behavior deserved your time, you immediately offered another day. You told yourself you were being understanding, but somewhere underneath that kindness was a question: what do I have to do to make this person choose me? And that question changes everything. Because now you're no longer connecting, you're auditioning. And people can feel the difference. Machiavelli's ideas about power were not really about becoming cruel. They were about understanding incentives, perception, and human self-interest. One of his most famous arguments is that when love and fear cannot coexist, a ruler is safer being feared than loved. But fear in ordinary life does not have to mean intimidation. It can mean consequence. It can mean presence. It can mean that your approval is not automatic, your time is not infinite, and your identity does not depend on being accepted. That's a very different kind of power. Imagine two people meeting the same woman. One immediately makes her the center of his life. He answers every message, cancels plans, constantly reassures her, and tries to prove how serious he is. The other genuinely likes her, but he still has work to do, friends to see, a body to train, a mind to develop, and a life that existed before she arrived. He doesn't ignore her. He simply doesn't disappear into her. Which one creates more psychological tension? Not because one is playing harder to get, but because one has something the other surrendered, a center of gravity. And this is where most people misunderstand attraction. The goal isn't to make someone chase you. The goal is to stop chasing someone who isn't moving toward you. Those sound similar, but they aren't. One is manipulation. The other is self-respect. And that distinction becomes even more important when rejection enters the picture. Rejection has a strange psychological effect. You don't always want the person more because they are right for you. Sometimes you want them more because they became unavailable. Suddenly your mind starts constructing a story. What did I do wrong? Why don't they see my value? What if I just try harder? And now you're not pursuing a person, you're pursuing a verdict. You want them to choose you because their choice feels like proof that you are worthy. That's the trap. No romantic relationship can permanently solve that problem. So instead of asking, how do I make her want me? Ask a more uncomfortable question. Why am I willing to abandon my standards just to be wanted? That question puts the power back where it belongs, not in her hands, but in yours. This is why building your own value matters, not as a performance designed to impress someone, but for yourself. Become competent. Become physically capable. Develop financial discipline, learn to communicate, build friendships. Pursue something that would still matter if nobody applauded you. Because the most attractive form of confidence isn't saying, you can't live without me. It's quietly knowing, I can live without you, but I would genuinely like you in my life. That difference can be felt immediately. And once you understand it, another principle appears: mystery, not deception. Mystery. Human attention is drawn toward unfinished information. Think about a conversation that ended with everything explained, every feeling disclosed, every thought clarified, every insecurity exposed, and every future intention announced. There is nothing wrong with honesty, but intimacy has a rhythm. If you reveal everything before trust has had time to develop, you can turn connection into information overload. You haven't given someone a chance to discover you. You've given them the entire map. And discovery matters. Think about a great story. The reason you keep reading isn't because the author tells you everything on page 1. It's because something remains unresolved. A question, a possibility, a hidden motive, a door that hasn't been opened yet. Human relationships can work the same way, not because people are puzzles to manipulate, but because genuine connection requires time. Let someone discover your character through experience. Don't announce every quality you possess. Demonstrate it. If you're disciplined, let your habits reveal it. If you're loyal, let your behavior prove it. If you're ambitious, let your work speak. If you're calm, don't keep telling people you're calm. Be calm when something goes wrong. That is where character becomes visible. And this brings us to another uncomfortable distinction. Being mysterious is not the same as being emotionally unavailable. A person who refuses to communicate isn't powerful, they're difficult. A person who deliberately creates confusion isn't mysterious, they're playing games. Real mystery comes from having depth that cannot be completely understood in one conversation. There is always more to learn because you are actually living, growing, thinking, and building. You don't need to manufacture uncertainty. Your life creates it naturally. But there is one more piece, perhaps the most important one. Your ability to remain calm when the situation becomes emotionally chaotic. Watch what happens when someone feels rejected. They explain, argue, send paragraphs, demand answers, and ask, "Why are you acting differently?" And with every message, they reveal something. This situation controls me. Now imagine the opposite. Someone disappoints you. You notice it. You don't explode. You don't beg. You don't pretend not to care. You simply decide what their behavior means and act accordingly. That is emotional control. And emotional control is one of the most underestimated forms of power. Because when you are desperate to be understood, you become easy to provoke. Someone can withhold attention and you chase. They become distant and you panic. They criticize you and you defend yourself for 20 minutes. They threaten to leave and suddenly every boundary disappears. The person who controls your emotional state has gained influence over you without asking for it. Machiavelli's world was full of uncertainty, betrayal, shifting alliances, and competing interests. His central lesson was not that everyone is evil. It was that you should understand reality as it is, rather than as you wish it to be. That lesson matters in relationships too. If someone repeatedly shows you that they are inconsistent, believe the pattern. If someone only wants you when you're useful, believe the pattern. If someone continually disrespects your boundaries, don't let your hope argue with their behavior. And if someone genuinely values you, don't force them to prove it every 5 minutes. This is where strength becomes different from control. Control says, "How do I make this person behave the way I want?" Strength asks, "What will I do if they don't?" That is a completely different question. And suddenly attraction becomes only one small part of the lesson. Because this isn't really about women, it's about human beings. The same principle appears in friendships, at work, in business, in leadership, and even online. The person constantly seeking approval becomes predictable. The person who has standards becomes harder to manipulate. The employee who desperately needs recognition may accept anything. The entrepreneur who can walk away from a bad deal negotiates differently. The leader who needs everyone to like him becomes vulnerable to whoever controls the applause. And the person who fears losing someone at all costs eventually teaches that person exactly how much power they have. So don't misunderstand the lesson. Don't start ignoring messages to manufacture desire. Don't pretend to be busy. Don't withhold affection because you think scarcity is a magic trick. That isn't power. That's insecurity wearing a costume. The real transformation happens somewhere deeper. You stop asking, "How can I make them chase me?" and start asking, "Why am I chasing someone who isn't choosing me?" You stop thinking, "How do I become impossible to leave?" and start thinking, "Why would I build a life that requires someone else to stay?" You stop trying to control perception and start controlling yourself. That is the paradox. The less desperately you need to be chosen, the more clearly you can choose. You can look at someone you deeply desire and still say no. You can love someone and still walk away. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. You can be kind without becoming submissive. You can be emotionally open without becoming emotionally dependent. And you can want someone without needing them. That is the difference between attachment and choice. Because when you need another person's approval, you negotiate against yourself. You lower the price, you abandon the boundary, you accept the excuse, you tolerate the disrespect, all because losing them feels worse than losing yourself. But once you stop fearing the loss, you begin to see the relationship clearly. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside Machiavelli's darker view of power. Power isn't always the ability to make someone stay. Sometimes it's the ability to remain whole when they leave. The strongest person in the room may not be the loudest, not the most intimidating, not the person with the most attention. It may be the person who doesn't need to prove anything because their behavior already answers the question. They don't chase every opportunity. They don't explain every decision. They don't beg for affection. They don't confuse being desired with being valuable. They build. They observe. They choose. And when someone enters their life, that person becomes part of the world they built, not the foundation holding it up. So perhaps the goal was never to make someone chase you. Perhaps the real goal was to become so grounded in your own life that you no longer need to chase anyone at all. Because the moment you stop running after approval, something changes. You finally have enough distance to see who is actually walking toward you. And that is where real power begins. Not when someone fears losing you, but when you no longer fear losing yourself. It is that calmness that makes a man unforgettable. Machiavelli understood that anyone who cannot govern himself eventually becomes vulnerable to those who can influence his emotions. And this isn't only true for a throne, it is true in love, friendship, leadership, and every relationship where emotions can be used against you. When someone becomes distant, can you remain composed? When you're teased, can you keep your dignity? When your pride is challenged, can you stand without needing to prove yourself? Think about the last time someone replied late. How many messages did you send afterward? The last time someone ignored you for hours, how many stories did your mind create? Every desperate reaction sends a silent message. Your behavior controls my emotional state. And once someone realizes they can control your emotions, they have influence over you. The calm man isn't calm because he feels nothing. He feels anger, jealousy, fear, and disappointment, just like everyone else. The difference is that he doesn't allow those emotions to make his decisions. He creates space between what happens and how he responds. That small space is where self-control lives. Think of Marcus Aurelius, who repeatedly reflected on the temporary nature of anger and adversity. His strength wasn't that he never experienced difficult emotions, it was that he refused to become their servant. The same principle applies today. When everyone else reacts instantly, the person who can pause has an advantage. So when something upsets you, don't immediately answer. Breathe. Observe. Let the emotion pass through you before you decide what deserves a response. Those few seconds can separate a person ruled by emotion from someone who remains in command of himself. And once you learn to control yourself, another problem becomes impossible to ignore. Respect. You can be loved, desired, and appreciated, but without boundaries, even love can become destructive. Many people sacrifice their dignity because they are terrified of losing someone. They accept disrespect, excuse repeated cancellations, laugh at insults that genuinely hurt them, and stay silent just to avoid conflict. They call it patience. Sometimes it is simply self-erasure. Every time you allow something that violates your values without saying anything, you teach the other person that your boundary isn't real. Betrayal doesn't always begin with one dramatic act. Sometimes it begins quietly, with one boundary ignored, then another, until eventually you no longer recognize yourself. A strong boundary doesn't require anger. You don't need to shout, threaten, or punish anyone. Sometimes all it takes is a calm sentence. That's not okay with me. Then comes the difficult part, being willing to act when that boundary is crossed again. Think about the difference between someone who says yes to everything and someone who can calmly say no when necessary. Who is easier to respect? Kindness without boundaries can become weakness in the eyes of others, while strength without kindness can become cruelty. The goal is neither. The goal is to remain kind without becoming easy to disregard. Ask yourself, how often have you stayed silent just to keep the peace, only to feel smaller afterward? That feeling is telling you something. You don't need to become cold. You need to become clear. Know what you will tolerate, know what you won't, and don't betray your own standards just to keep someone close, because there is another danger that is even harder to notice. Sometimes you don't lose your identity through conflict. You lose it through love. In the beginning, you have goals, routines, ambitions, friendships, and a sense of direction. Then someone enters your life, and slowly you begin trading those things away. One workout becomes optional. One dream gets postponed. One commitment disappears. Eventually, you look around and realize that the person you were before the relationship has slowly vanished. You call it sacrifice. But sometimes sacrifice is simply surrender with a more beautiful name. Your life is your territory, your mission, your discipline, your ambitions, your freedom. When you abandon them to keep someone beside you, you don't just lose your goals. You lose the qualities that made your life meaningful in the first place. And often those qualities were part of what made you attractive to begin with. Passion creates energy. Purpose creates direction. Discipline creates confidence. Remove all of them, and you may still have a relationship, but you may no longer have the person that relationship was built around. Think about someone whose entire identity revolves around their partner. Their schedule depends on the other person. Their mood depends on the other person's attention. Their ambitions are constantly adjusted to accommodate the relationship. What happens eventually? They stop being a person with a life and become an extension of someone else's life. That is not sovereignty. That is dependence. Real love should add to your world, not require you to destroy it. You can care deeply about someone and still protect your path. You can make compromises without abandoning your identity. You can say, I want you beside me, but I will not become someone else just to keep you. That isn't selfishness. It is self-respect. And if someone leaves because you refuse to abandon everything that matters to you, painful as it may be, their departure may reveal something important. They wanted access to you, but not necessarily the real you. The sovereign person doesn't stop loving. They simply refuse to become a servant to love. They keep building. They keep learning. They keep moving forward. And if someone truly belongs in their life, that person walks beside them, rather than demanding that they turn around. This is where everything comes together. True magnetism doesn't come from frantic pursuit. It appears when you stop abandoning yourself for approval. You no longer need to prove your worth. You no longer need to chase attention. You no longer need to explain every decision or convince someone to stay. You become someone who knows what he values, controls his emotions, protects his boundaries, and continues building his own life. That man isn't a tyrant. He doesn't need to control other people. He controls himself. He doesn't demand respect through fear. His consistency creates it. He doesn't manipulate people into staying. He accepts that anyone has the freedom to leave, and that freedom is exactly what makes his choice meaningful. Think back to the beginning. The desperate man asks, how do I make her choose me? The sovereign man asks a completely different question. Am I living in a way that allows me to choose too? That's the transformation. Build value but don't perform for approval. Keep depth but don't play artificial games. Master your emotions but don't suppress them. Set boundaries but don't become cruel. Protect your freedom but don't become incapable of intimacy. None of this is about controlling another person. It is about becoming difficult to control yourself. Because once you can control your own impulses, your fear of rejection, your need for validation, and your desire to be constantly reassured, other people lose the easiest ways to manipulate you. And then something changes. You stop measuring your worth by who stays. You stop treating rejection as a verdict. You stop believing that love requires self-abandonment. You realize that being chosen means very little if you had to destroy yourself to earn it. The real question was never, how do I make her chase me? It was always, why am I willing to chase someone at the cost of myself? Once you understand that, you no longer need to sit on a throne above anyone. You simply become the ruler of your own life. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Your greatest source of power is not the ability to make someone stay, but the strength to remain yourself when they decide to leave. Because in the end, your value is not measured by how many people choose you. It is measured by the one thing you refuse to surrender for anyone: yourself.